Welcome to the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible but were afraid to ask. I'm your host, Katie Langston.
And I'm Catherine Schifferdecker.
And today we are delighted to welcome a very special guest, Jennifer Kaland. She is an associate professor of New Testament at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Welcome, Jennifer.
So good to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. So happy to have you here.
Yeah. And today we're tackling, just a tiny little question, one that barely comes up at all. And that is, what does the Bible have to say about the end times? And I should confess, I grew up in the Mormon tradition, and we had a lot to say about the end times, but I'm pretty sure most of it was not actually biblical. But anyway.
And I grew up in the Lutheran tradition that didn't like to talk about the end times. So we're kind of coming from opposite backgrounds. but let's hand it over to you to begin with, Jennifer.
Yeah, Jennifer.
I mean, it's such a great question, right? And in some ways, really timely. So since we're having these confessional moments, I have a bit of a confession myself, where my 15-year-old son recently came to me and said, so I saw something on TikTok, and which is always red flag, right?
Yep.
I said, and so I'm wondering about, Revelation and predicting the end times. And I said, as a New Testament professor, like, where did you get this from? Who's teaching you these things? This can't be.
The algorithm.
How did you stumble upon this? So part of me is like happy that he might be coming across biblical things, and the other part is not so happy about the things that he has stumbled upon.
Oh, no.
But because of the coronavirus, because of lots of the effects that we're seeing right now with climate change, I think it's a pertinent question that people really are wondering if the things that we've read about in the biblical text are the things that we are seeing in front of us right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when we read about a plague, is that what this is? I think that's a legitimate question for people to ask. But I also think we should think, what do we mean when we say the end times or the end of time? Certainly growing up, the end of time for me meant this kind of catastrophic ending of the world, right? Thanks to Hollywood. That's the way I tend to think about
whether it's from a meteor or from there's all kinds of ways the world can end. And
right.
Hollywood has explored lots of them.
I was told a fire. I was told it would be a fire, so that would consume all the sinners. So I don't know that was Hollywood, but
no, but I'm sure we have seen it on screen, right? That kind of picture of probably a fiery meteor hitting New York City or something to that effect. But my sister shared this with me many, many years ago, and it stuck with me. And she told me, she said, people really get caught up in this end of the world thing. But the reality is the end of the world is when the world ends for you. And this preoccupation, right? I mean, it's been happening for hundreds of years, thousands, if you think about the Mayan calendar, right? The Mayan calendar ended in 2012. And so people thought there would be no world after 2012, right? And we had this conversation around the year 2000 when people were making preparations. We didn't think the computers would be able to handle that digital change. And, there was this fear that, again, the world was coming to an end. And so we've seen it historically. But that just really stuck with me, is that this kind of preoccupation, I think, with this vision that we have, most of it not from the Bible, quite frankly, we lose sight, I think, of something that might be more important to think about, which is kind of our own end, if you will, our smaller kind of apocalypses, as opposed to many apocalypses, if you will, as opposed to this kind of one big moment in history that, should it be true, most of us would not even witness, right?
That's true.
That's a great point.
Is the way we think about it. So
yeah. So in scripture, though, before we started recording, we were talking, of course, a bit about the book of Revelation, because that's the book that comes to mind for
Yes.
most people, I think, both because of, Hollywood and church tradition, certain church traditions, because that's the book that has all these weird apocalyptic visions of beasts and burning pools of fire and things like that. So so that, we want to talk about Revelation, but you said before we started recording, well, there's a lot about the end of time outside of the book of Revelation as well. So what scripture would you go to? What scripture would you talk about first, say to your son, or someone else who's talking about, how is the world going to end, or is the world ending right now? What scripture would you go to first?
Yes, I would probably, well, I don't know that I would want to actually go there, but I would go to the Gospels. There are gospel accounts, right, that are the synoptic gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have this place where they're talking about the signs that we should be watching for. But that conversation in those gospels is centered around the destruction of the temple. Right. So it's Jesus and the disciples are leaving the temple, and Jesus, in my paraphrase, kind of says, look, guys, this stone won't be left unturned. Like, it's going to be destroyed. Right. And they all walk away, and they're like, wait a minute, Jesus, what do you mean? You want to talk a little bit more about that? Right. Can we get some details?
Say just a little bit
and it's all kind of set as this private conversation between Jesus and the disciples. And Jesus then goes into, shorter in the Gospel of Mark, but a much more extended version in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, this kind of conversation about the signs, what we would describe as the signs of the end of time. And there in Matthew 24, we see, woe to the woman who is pregnant and who is, going to give birth during this time. Jesus talks to the disciples about the possibility of them being either martyred or persecuted for his name's sake, right? And so there's that kind of mini apocalyptic language found in the Gospels as well. But I would say this around this conversation is the same that I would say around the book of Revelation, which is we need to look at the context of the text itself, right? Which is the destruction of a major religious symbol would have been apocalyptic for the group that Jesus is talking to, right? And so to try to understand what is happening, right? Why would armies be surrounding Jerusalem, right? These kinds of things that Jesus is pointing to, perhaps were not about some future, distant future that even we are still looking for, but may have been about the way Jesus saw what was unfolding in his very own time.
Because the temple is destroyed, of course, by the Romans in 70.
Exactly.
AD, right? So it's kind of what you were saying before about what your sister said, right? It's not so much about the end of the world, but it's the end of the world as we know it. Right?
Exactly.
And so this, or our own end, right? This kind of small apocalypses.
And the end of the world as we know it, which I love that, right? It seems to happen over and over and over again in different ways, which is why I think
just happened.
Yes, right. Which is why these texts resonate with us in the way that they do. Isn't that what the Bible often is to us? It's the place we go to when we're looking for answers, right? I can't gather with the people I'm used to gathering with every Sunday. So what do I do, right? What does that mean? We go to the biblical text. We go to our sacred texts for those answers. And they seem relevant to us today, right? They're timeless. And that is why, because in their own context, there was this moment of what seemed to be the end of the world as they knew it.
Yeah. So what kind of comfort do these stories have for us, or message, or
judgment and terror?
Other than judgment and terror.
I'm bringing my baggage again.
It's very real. It's very real. It is hard to let go of, I have to tell you,
Yeah.
right? Even
Yeah.
even someone who reads and understands the context of Revelation, in my reading of Revelation, it's a very anti-imperial text, right? It is a text that is written, a lot of the code like language. This is the conversation I had with my son, is
Yep.
really about, I can't speak outrightly to, against the powers that be of my time. And so I'm saying it in a kind of coded way. But what they wanted to see was a different world, right? This is where Revelation
Right.
ends, is this vision of a new world, new heaven and new earth, but a new world as they wanted to see something very different than they were living in. And I think that's the hope, right? Is this kind of vision of something different than we currently have. All endings have beginnings, if you will. And so that ending that we're talking about of the world as we know it is an opportunity for a new beginning. And I think therein lies the hope and the positive message.
Can I ask a question that is like just bubbling up for me? And that is, so, in the creed, and I know the creed's not the Bible, but in the creed, we do talk about, that Jesus will come again. And so like, biblically, what does that mean? Like, what do we understand that to mean? Because again, the images that I have are of a very literal, like, destruction of the world, and then Jesus like descends. And I'm guessing that probably isn't exactly what I should be expecting, but so like, what are the what types of, when we talk about the new heaven and the new earth and the new world and that sort of thing, like what can we be expecting for real?
No, that's a great question. And I've been thinking about this question probably since my son asked. And so, of course, when you guys were like, maybe, I was like, of course, I need to talk to someone else about this.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the things that I wonder, right? Is that we know, right, the resurrection of Jesus was a return of Jesus, right? And so this coming beyond the resurrection is a question of, well, what if the resurrection was the coming? What if that was the beginning of the new age and we're just not living into it? It's a question. It's a question for me, right? Because in the Gospels, in these gospel accounts where Jesus is telling them to look at these signs and, kind of cautioning them, well, you'll see these signs, but it's still not the end yet, right? You will see these things happening, but it's still not the end yet. At this point, Jesus is still with his disciples, right? And so again, contextually thinking about this, the coming would have been his resurrection, right? That would have been a return of Jesus. And so I think that is something for us to consider is Jesus is with us, right? Jesus did return. And what if we have lost sight of that, looking for, 2050, 2028, whatever that number may be? People are still trying to make those predictions, right? What if we're so busy looking at those numbers that we've lost sight of the fact that perhaps that coming has occurred? But certainly, Katie, to your point though, the image of Jesus descending from a cloud is very clearly in the text as well, right? I mean, First Thessalonians,
Right.
I always think about First Thessalonians when I think, and I use that image often when I'm teaching First Thessalonians, is that the concern of that community in Thessaloniki for Paul was, wait, like this Jesus thing happened after my people died. So what's going to happen to those people, right? They're really concerned about, like, they didn't get this message. And so what happens to them? And Paul gives us this imagery of Jesus descending, right? And we would be caught up to meet him, or maybe us ascending too, right? There's this idea of us meeting in the sky in some way. So I always imagine it's Jesus descending, us ascending to meet Jesus. And so certainly the gospel writers, as well as Paul, the New Testament writers, had a vision of Jesus returning to the earth and creating or establishing a different kingdom. And again, I think a vision of something we've never seen before.
So there's the theologians like to talk about the now and not yet, right?
Mm.
So what you were saying before about Jesus coming in the resurrection, right? Jesus coming back in the resurrection is certainly the breaking in of that new age, right? That these texts talk about. And yet it's not fully here yet, right? I mean, death still has power, right? We're talking about this right around All Saints, right? It's where we remember in liturgical tradition, we remember the saints that have gone before us, and and certainly we've seen the power of death in the last 20 months, right? With the 5 million people dead in the world, 750,000 in the United States, right? From COVID. And so while we trust in God's promises and we rejoice in the resurrection and the promise of the resurrection, there's still this longing for something more, right? When death will finally be swallowed up in victory, right? So how, like, what hope? Well, I guess I just talked about that hope, right? What did the text say about that?
And I think we can go back to Revelation, right? That God shall wipe every tear from your eye, right? That there will be no more mourning, there will be no more death, right? And so when we as the writer of Revelation probably did, right? When we envision this kind of utopia, if you will, this world where this kind of the way we think of all the good and perfect things, if you will, occur, right? That is what we think of, is a world where there is no more death, where there's no more mourning, where there is happiness. Actually, there's eternal light in the book of Revelation, right?
Right.
There's no need for the sun because God is the sun, right? Provides the sun, which is kind of a beautiful image, although I wonder how I might sleep.
Exactly.
I'm just really tired.
I think in the heavenly city, they've got really good blackout like blinds, or like maybe like really like fancy sleep masks, like the fanciest you could ever imagine,
One could hope.
literally heaven.
Well, I want to go back for just a minute to, you had talked a little bit earlier about the empire, right? That the revelation is anti-empire, right? And the empire, of course, that we're talking about in that context is the Roman Empire.
Yes,
right?
yes.
But I've heard, or my understanding is that Revelation, with all its weird images and scary images, has spoken over the centuries to other communities, right? Not just the first century Jews under the Roman Empire, but Jews and Christians, but other communities that are oppressed, right? And that, as you said so well, they want to see a different world because the world that they're living in right now is really bad and really oppressive.
Yes, I mean, this is. And this is, I think, what's beautiful about the Bible and the text itself, is that there is this timeless element, right? To it. And to your point, an oppressed community can look at the book of Revelation and see this vision of a world where there is not this oppression, right? You think of the cargo list in the book of Revelation, where they're enslaved people and they're, all these goods and services and the interruption of that, right? I think Revelation is pointing that out, and perhaps a way to critique a system that values things, maybe more than it values the life of the very people. That feels and sounds familiar to me, right? And so as we're thinking about oppressed communities, as we're thinking about workers, right? Like I've over the past 6 months, we've heard so much about the workforce, the lack of people, right? As we're thinking about the book of Revelation and that kind of the oppressed people, who does it speak to? I think, right? It is a way of looking at the world to say, it doesn't have to be this way,
Yeah.
right?
Can you
And that's
say
what the
just
pandemic gave us is it doesn't, we realized it doesn't have to be this way, because for about 18 months, it wasn't that way,
Right.
right?
Right.
And how do we value what people feel is a sacrifice, right? Going into work over the past
Right.
18 months felt not just like the joyous, I am going into work and I enjoy teaching, but a bit of that felt like a personal sacrifice because of the fear of what could happen. In the moment that we start to kind of monetize that, I think that's when you start to see this kind of cargo list.
Say just a little. I know what you mean by the cargo list, but can you say just a
Yes.
little more for our listeners about what you mean by that in Revelation?
Yes. So the text itself is so rich in imagery. So it's like, where do I go? What do I want to talk about? But that's just what came up when you were talking about oppressed people. For me, was the cargo list. And so there's a list in the book of Revelation. And I'm sorry, I don't have the chapter right in front of me. It might take me a second to kind of find that. But it's a list of kind of goods that are being traded during this kind of first century period. And so it includes kind of, the normal goods that one would think about. But it also, part of that cargo list also was enslaved people as well, right? Which is, slavery was a concept in the first century world.
Absolutely.
And so I'm pointing to that to say that part of, I think, what the writer of Revelation is doing is critiquing the system. Right, critiquing the system with the woman of Babylon, right? Critiquing a system that is drinking the wines of the riches of the land, right? At the expense, more often than not, of the people, right? At the expense of if you will, of the workers, and getting wealthy.
Babylon. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just again, for our listeners who aren't familiar, Babylon here, obviously. At this point in the first century, Babylon is not a world power, but it's what symbol or a word for the empire, the Roman Empire.
Roman
because
Empire.
As you say, you can't write that directly, right? You have to
exactly.
It, exactly. But it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that it's the Roman Empire. I think that. Oh, go ahead, Katie.
No, go. I was just going to say, I think, so Catherine, if you have something that's on this topic, then I was going to ask a different question. So go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to say, the thing that gives us hope is that the empire is not that. Let me put it positively rather than negatively. That God is more powerful than the empire, right?
Yes.
That in the end, it's not Babylon or the Roman Empire or the fill in the blank for whatever empire you're talking about. Capitalistic machine, that God is more powerful than that, and that in the end God reigns, right? Is that, I mean, that's the foundation of the hope. I think that in the midst of all the scary imagery and whatever, God is the foundation of the hope of the oppressed, right? Not necessarily their own power.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, sorry.
And I think sometimes it feels like really irrational and silly to hope for that. And maybe sometimes we can talk ourselves out of it, but I think that is basically that sort of now but not yet tension that we're living in. It's we don't know exactly, because the language in the scripture is so symbolic, right? And they're trying to use pictures and images to get at something that is incomprehensible and has yet to be seen. And so to hope for that, on the one hand, feels very silly, but on the other hand, seems to be the thing that can bring us through our own mini apocalypses and personal deaths, as well as the ones that are coming cosmically.
Absolutely. I mean, hope is crucial, right? I think hope is crucial. And this hope, and I would even go so far as to say belief, right? Our belief in resurrection is what I think gives us that hope for another, right? Another vision, another way of seeing, seeing what we probably have already seen, right? In so many ways. The text has given us this image of the river of life, right? We've seen the possibility of the heavenly city. We've seen, right? That we had that vision. And so we can live into that hope.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, and you can get more great resources, reflections, conversations, courses, commentaries at our website, enterthebible.org. And also, I invite you to rate and review this podcast in iTunes or wherever you get your podcast, and be sure to share the podcast with a friend. Until next time.